Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bruno Serafin. I'm a PhD candidate here at Cornell in the Anthropology department. I'm one of the co-organizers of this speaker series on American ecofascism, past and present. I want to begin today by acknowledging that Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, or the Cayuga Nation. And the Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. And the land acknowledgement that I just read has been reviewed and approved by the traditional Gayokono leadership. And as we all know, land acknowledgements are only acknowledgements and need to lead to action and changes in policy, practice, and behavior. One small thing you can all do today is visit the website for the Cayuga Share Farm, which is here in the Finger Lakes, and it's promoting the future of Gayokono sovereignty and rematriation. So that's, you can go to cayugasharefarm.org, CAYUGASHAREFARM.org. So I want to welcome everybody, our in-person audience as well as our virtual audience tuning in through Cornell. This event is being recorded and will be viewable online afterwards using the same URL that you use to watch the stream. And we encourage questions both from our in-person audience and from our virtual audience. Those watching through eCornell, you can submit questions in the chat box in the top right corner of the video box on your screen. And throughout the discussion, we'll also be sharing URLs and resources in the chat as well, so keep an eye out for those. And if you are currently watching the archived recording, those links are available in the overview section just below, I guess, at the bottom of your screen. So thank you, and I'll pass it off to the other organizer of the series, Chloe Ahmann.
Thanks. I have a fancy mic, so I'm going to pass that to you. All right, welcome everybody here and online to the last of 4 events in this term's colloquium series, American Ecofascism, Past and Present, generously supported by the American Studies program and facilitated by our brilliant administrator, Melissa Totman. So my name is Chloe Ahmann, and I'm an assistant professor of anthropology as well as affiliate faculty in the American Studies program here at Cornell, and honored to be co-organizing this series with Bruno Serafin, one of our advanced doctoral students you just heard from. So I want to start this event, as I've started the others, with a few words about the series before I introduce our speaker for today. So as this audience is likely well aware, the past few years have seen a lot of apocalyptic violence from avowed eco-fascists. And here I'll be clear that when we're thinking about ecofascism in this series, we're naming an ideology that countenances eugenic violence in the name of restoring spoiled nature. Mass shooters who ravaged Christchurch, El Paso, and Buffalo all espouse this ideology explicitly, and their extreme acts have brought increased attention to this dark phenomenon. But they're only the most spectacular face of a pervasive set of structures and beliefs about who the environment is for and whose being counts as existential threat that are foundational to the United States. This series is inspired by a long genealogy of anti-colonial thought and action, pushing back against white supremacist environmentalisms in the Americas. And that genealogy teaches us to look beyond events of terroristic violence and toward regimes of law and property, conservation and protection, toward the intimate ties between environmental stewardship and white supremacy that unfurled on the frontier and have defined the US settler project ever since, and toward the many ways that eco-fascist myths creep into environmental discourse in the present day. And so we pose these questions to our speakers. First, what is distinctly American about American eco-fascism? Second, what is distinctly fascist about the US settler project? What is new and what is very old about the environmental apocalypse that we hear so much about today? And also, what does recognizing eco-fascist fantasy as a structuring premise of the American project then demand of American studies scholars? we are really lucky to have had an interdisciplinary group of anti-colonial, anti-fascist thinkers joining us this term to lead these important conversations. So in case you missed our first 3 events, we were joined in February by Dr. Rajani Bhatia for a talk on eco-fascist demographic anxieties, and a recording of that talk is available via eCornell. If you're watching online, I think a link to that registration will be dropped into the chat. In March, we were lucky to host a talk by Harsha Walia on the border as fascism, and that talk was not recorded, but you should absolutely read her book, Border and Rule, also being dropped into the chat. And yesterday, we hosted a fantastic roundtable with the 5 creators of Against the Eco-Fascist Creep, which is a webzine and teaching resource designed to expose and debunk 6 everyday eco-fascist myths that circulate in a variety of media. If you're here in person, we actually have copies of the zine, and you should absolutely take one. Recording of that conversation is going to be available through eCornell, or maybe already is, and that link is ending up in the chat. And in the meantime, please check out the zine also in the chat. The chat is full of delightful resources. Last but certainly not least, I am really honored to introduce today's speaker, Dr. April Anson. Dr. Anson is an assistant professor of Public Humanities at San Diego State University, core faculty for the Institute for Ethics and Public Affairs, and affiliate faculty in American Indian Studies. And come this fall, she will join the English department at the University of Connecticut. Before joining San Diego State, she was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Anson's research, in her own words, explores the historical and ongoing connections between climate change and white supremacy, and the indigenous environmental justice traditions that eclipse those relations. She is co-founder of the Anti-Creep Climate Initiative, who we heard from yesterday, and with that initiative, or with that collective, is the co-author of the webzine Against the Eco-Fascist Creep. Her writing has also appeared in Boundary 2, Resilience, Environmental History, Western American Literature, and a range of other journals and edited volumes. I would like to particularly draw your attention to one of her public-facing works, No One is a Virus, published online in the first year of the pandemic in Environmental History Now, also in the chat, which is one of the first texts that I send students who are looking for a primer on the themes that animate this series. So we will be sure to share that with all of you. And I'll just end by saying that in all of her work, Anson remains, in her words, committed to anti-racist and anti-colonial knowledge production and to social movements. So today, Dr. Anson will be speaking about American eco-fascism, Glaciers, Whiteness genre. Please join me in welcoming her to Cornell.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Chloe, for that robust introduction. It's quite embarrassing to hear. And thank you to Bruno also for the introduction and for the invitation. Thanks to Melissa for organizing, and for American Studies and Cornell for having me. It's a real honor to be here on Gayakono lands, and still kind of unbelievable honor to have my name listed under or alongside such incredible scholars as you've already featured. I'm really humbled. And so I'm going to just tell you a little bit. I'm going to squeeze this over. There we go. So I work right now on Kumeyaay territory. And the Kumeyaay currently, along with the Tohono O'odham people of the Sonoran Desert, are in a fight and have been in a fight to restore their lands from the last 40 years of border wall construction. This is a fight that is, I think we often think of border wall construction as maybe a more recent fight, but this is something that Kumeyaay and the Tohono O'odham people have been holding down for decades. And the Kumeyaay, along with the Tohono O'odham people, like indigenous peoples across the globe, are in distinct fights for their territorial, cultural, and political sovereignty. And these are fights that I hope my work shows are absolutely at the core of any attempt to fight, mitigate, or survive climate change. So I'm going to first tell you a little bit about how I come to my work on American ecofascism, why literary analysis is vital for understanding American ecofascism and the rise of global ecofascism today, a bit about my current book project before scoping out to answer some of the questions that Chloe has posed, some of the challenges I see American ecofascism posing for American studies scholars and beyond. But first, a content warning. I'm sure the title of the series has alerted us, but I'm going to touch on some pretty disturbing and sensitive topics, including mass murder, but I promise not to rest in those violences, but privilege the hope that Indigenous resistance inspires. But do take care of your hearts as we move through these difficult topics. So a little bit about me. I was raised by hippies and loggers on what I now know as Kalapuya Ilihi, or the homelands of the Kalapuya people in what's currently called Eugene, Oregon. And from a really young age, I considered myself an environmentalist, which growing up in the 80s and 90s in that area, I understood largely through the region's tensions between environmental groups like Earth First and extraction industries, particularly the logging industry. And these tensions became kind of iconic for me and many others in the spotted owl debate. So for those of you unfamiliar, the spotted owl debate was framed as an irreconcilable difference over how to use public land. The environmentalists argued for the owl's placement on the endangered species list. The logging industry, the commercial logging industry, argued against the projected loss of some 30 to 160,000 jobs. And media, like this Time magazine cover, abounded. And I grew up with family really virulently on both sides of this debate. My father's mother rescued owls in her spare time and other wild animals, while my mother's mother owned this t-shirt. Oh, well, there's a little animation error here. Forgive me, but you can preview where we're going. So it says, "Save a logger, eat an owl." And I'm remiss to say that we didn't save this t-shirt after she passed. So, you know, this kind of debate between protectionist arguments, right, whether it's protecting the owl's brood or my own or our own family, really limited my imagination to what environmentalism meant. And my family is the kind of representative whole for how to use public land or land management. This limited imagination is not unique to me. Of course, it's something that Kyle White and others remind us would have been this fantasy of settlers in the 19th century. A fantasy to think that their ancestor, like me, could grow up without any acknowledgement of whose land I'm on. And so I've really deeply lived this settler fantasy, and it's something that my work is continually committed to showing gets coded into a form of environmental thinking that limits our imaginations to the world's responsible for climate chaos. And so, you know, we see this in the spotted owl debates of the 1980s and 90s, but also earlier in what was called the walleye wars of the 1970s, where sports fishermen and resort owners used the slogan, "Save a walleye, spear an Indian," to oppose Ojibwa hunting and fishing rights. But they were really appropriating a slogan that came from liberal environmentalist movement Deep Ecology, "Save the planet, kill yourself." But as you kind of saw in the preview, right, all of these are really echoing an inverted version of "kill the Indian, save the man." Most commonly associated with Richard Pratt, who is also an individual known to be the first person to use the word racism in his criticism of racial segregation. So all that to say, appeals to extinction have long protected settler interests across the political spectrum, right? And I think these rhetorical precedents really clarify something largely missing from our understanding of ecofascism today, which typically regards ecofascism as a far-right phenomenon that uses concern for species extinction and fear and morphs it into fears of white genocide, the so-called displacement of indigenous white people by invasive species. And often it's marshaled towards an argument that whites need to be protected with their own border like an endangered species. So we know the rhetoric of endangered species alone proves ecofascist appeals are not far, they're not right, and they are nothing new. This is a point that I elaborate alongside the brilliant, Cornell's own brilliant Anandita Banerjee in a recent article for the the special issue of Boundary 2 on lineages of the new right. And here and elsewhere, we're talking about how ecofascism lurks in the everyday and both depends upon and crosses state borders. It can take the form of green colonialism, which uses the need for sustainable materials to justify further exploitation of communities. Lithium mining is a very easy example of this. And that's a point that Sam Moore and Alex Roberts make in their recent book, The Rise of Ecofascism. We also see ecofascism represented in mass media. Works like the Matrix films, the Marvel universe, especially Thanos, and then series like What Happened to Monday all feature eco-fascist villains And all are very sympathetic treatments of these eco-fascist villains. So, Marvel Studios went so far as to have Thanos claim, "I am inevitable," in a film that made him make sense. So much sense that he became a bumper sticker in my neighborhood. But this kind of common sense template, like Ted Kaczynski, crosses political divides. Kaczynski, Thanos, and popular media are expressing the exact same sentiment that the El Paso shooter wrote about in 2019. And I'm going to put his words up now. He writes, "The decimation of the environment is creating a massive burden for future generations. If we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can be sustainable." So even though these sentiments seem to be on the rise, they have long lurked in leftist environmental spaces. We can cite something that was recently recirculated as a really indicative example of this is Earth First's publication of this question, "Is AIDS the answer?" to an environmentalist's prayer. That was in 1987. It got recirculated in the context of COVID when people like the founder of the Toronto Sustainability Series asked, "Is COVID-19 the silver bullet for a stable climate?" Which seems like a one-off until we realize or remember that the UN environmental minister in 2020 said essentially the same thing. This kind of question space, right, repeats the El Paso shooter's assertion that mass death is an environmental good. It was so ubiquitous that the New York Times dubbed it the coronavirus nature genre. This genre was comprised primarily of tweeted memes, all praising air pollution slowing down, water pollution clearing up, natural wildlife returning home. And this is an absolute emblematic case of what scholars call passive ecofascism, explaining away mass death, right? Because we know that calling something a virus is a favorite source concept for racist and xenophobic metaphors. It's a metaphor that asserts the enemy is not only inhuman, he or she is not even visible. It's not a mammal, right? So therefore killable in a kind of homo sacer sense. But this metaphor of humans as a virus is foundational to what many consider 20th century mainstream environmental thinking. It was popularized in James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, where he writes, "Humans on Earth behave in some ways like a pathogenic microorganism or the cells of a tumor." And full disclosure, I wrote my undergraduate thesis praising the Gaia hypothesis. So, not to assert that I'm immune in any way to this thinking, but we now know that Lovelock's work was funded by Royal Dutch Shell. We also know that Lovelock himself admitted his central argument could only be enforced by force, that he pined for an authoritarian world that would eliminate the cancerous tumors. So, let's beware. And this is, again, not just a past phenomenon. We have some of our most beloved environmental thinkers today, like Donna Haraway, who was recently quoted saying, "The earth itself is rising against its destroyers." Haraway's metaphor insinuates here that those who suffer from climate change are the ones who destroy the climate, right? This is like calling humans a cancer. It's a metaphor that erases the systems and corporations most responsible for climate change and then funnels blame towards those who climate change most affects, who statistically speaking are the ones least responsible. So this is a grand evasive maneuver, and this rhetoric is also reinforced by some of the most popular conservationist groups today, like the Sierra Club's recent campaign, also a bumper sticker in my neighborhood. Not to say anything about my neighborhood, but this kind of slight tour, this brief tour, tells us that ecofascism is not far, it's not right, it's nothing new. It is a long environmental tradition that says that violence is natural, necessary, inevitable. And that, I think, tells us that fiction is at the very root of ecofascism. And the first paragraph of the El Paso shooter's screed tells us as much, so I'm going to put that up now. He writes, "This attack is a response to the Hispanic invasion of Texas. They are the instigators, not me. I'm simply defending my country from cultural and ethnic replacement brought on by an invasion. Some people will think this statement is hypocritical because of the nearly complete ethnic and cultural destruction brought to the Native Americans by our European ancestors, but this just reinforces my point. the natives didn't take the invasion of Europeans seriously. And then he says, actually, the Hispanic community was not my target before I read The Great Replacement. So he's already giving us an indication of the intellectual tradition that he is, not only just parroting, but thinks he's adding to. I think he's also telling us something more, which is that it feels very clear to me that he is just projecting tropes straight from 19th century Western frontier romance, right? Onto a kind of imagined climate future where he is, like Native people, the victim of invasion. And then he's using that speculative fiction of this supposedly inevitable future to justify mass murder. And this is, as Harsha Walia's talk in the series makes clear, an invocation of my country that exemplifies that the crisis is not of the border, it is due to the border. That there is no ecofascism without the border. So again, just to emphasize, to read her incredible book. So this text exemplifies the environmental version of fascism as colonialism turned inward, I think very, very acutely. But what is more, it also demonstrates the essential role the literary imagination plays in the settler fantasies that Kyle White describes, transforming the material realities of genocide and the sixth extinction into a fictional loss or threat of white habitat loss. And this is in order to then justify the extinction structures that make those fantasies possible. So it is an incredibly suffocating, self-reinforcing logic where the historical fact of genocide just reinforces his point of more genocide. It is, I read it as a self-reinforcing story structure that is essentially obsessed with perpetrating and then projecting extinction. So to show you what I mean, in his text, The Inconvenient Truth, right, this is an obvious homage or allusion to Al Gore's 2006 documentary. He also cites or plagiarizes the Christchurch screed. It was titled The Great Replacement, a text that took its title and its ideas from a 2011 French eco-fascist text, The Great Replacement. That text was largely plagiarized from a 1992 book called The Ethno-State, which likens white people to the endangerment of the redwoods. And that is a rhetorical move popularized by Madison Grant. Madison Grant is a late 19th century, early 20th century white nature lover, famously and I think almost ubiquitously cited by scholars of fascism and ecofascism, very commonly reminding us that his book, The Passing of the Great Race, was cited as by Hitler, cited as his Bible. But less attended to are the ways that Grant was telling an obvious fiction. So just as a real quick example, he writes, the laws of nature require the obliteration of the unfit, and human life is valuable only when it is of use to the community or race. So this is a story about so-called natural law, right? A kind of speculative fiction that says what the laws of nature require without any evidence. This is parroted by the El Paso killer when he writes, this just reinforces my point. This is a because I said so structure, pulling evidence out of nothing, or ex nihilo. But Grant, of course, was not alone. He and his frontier-loving friends, there's a little formatting issue, with importing to Google Slides, but we can see the names. Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, all famous white nature lover buddies. We can go even earlier to Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis, which I'll talk about in just a minute. We can go earlier to John Muir's Racial Sublime, Andrew Jackson's removal policies and nature protection policies, but also to Andrew Jackson's avowed critic, beloved origin of American environmental thinking, Ralph Waldo Emerson, also called the philosopher king of white racial theory by Nell Irvin Painter. We can go even earlier, Thomas Jefferson's Racist Notes of Virginia, all the way to John Locke's euphemistic private property story. All of these, I think, constitute an early archive of American ecofascism to which 20th and 21st century figures belong. And this tells us that ecofascism cannot be explained without the idea and material history of America. It's a suffocatingly self-referential archive, and this is just emblematic, not exhaustive, of all the different ways that these authors are drawing on one another. And social science researchers today are very attentive to the way that contemporary far-right manifestos are intentionally self-referential. They're trying to create a faux intellectual tradition to gain new followers. But I think, and in adding to that, I think the El Paso Manifesto, or excuse me, Screed, tells us even more, tells us how key the environmental fictional imagination is to this literary tradition, or excuse me, to this tradition. And so that's what my book project, my current book project focuses on. Essentially arguing that in order to build climate futures beyond fascism, we have to account for this self-referential intellectual tradition by extending the genealogy of ecofascism to 19th century American environmental thinking. So my book is tentatively titled Unfensible, Ecofascism, Genrecide, and the Sovereignties That Can Save Us. And it argues that ecofascism is a literary tradition that uses literary genres to make white violence natural, inevitable, generic, even atmospheric. A kind of literary correlate to what Southern Paiute anthropologist Kristen Simmons calls settler atmospherics. Or if, in a less kind of anthropological sense, a literary archive for what the IPCC report has just told us, which is that colonialism's racist structures are the primary driver of climate change. In other words, these fictions, this archive, fences. And by that I mean it contains our imaginations, it traffics in stolen goods, and it evades responsibility. Exemplifying what Robin Maynard just recently wrote or described to Leanne Betesamake Simpson when she says, "The climate catastrophe was not born from mankind, but from the slave plantation, the settler town, the prison, the reservation. It's unsurprising then that the solutions being forwarded by those in power are more of the same. The border wall, the immigration detention center, the refugee camp, the open pit mine. For us to live in anything that I hope we can one day call freedom, it is necessary to put a swift end to the death drive disguised as worldview, the murderous episteme that is being imposed on us by the master settler CEO." And this kind of murderous episteme declares, in the words of Adrienne Maree Brown, that there isn't enough. So we need to hoard, enclose, divide, fence. And then Brown calls us to imagine beyond those fears. Beyond what environmental humanities scholars have recently called, in the words of Dr. Stephanie Limenager, the genre trouble of climate change. That the ways, the stories, the type of stories that we tell about climate change just secures the systems most responsible for it. And this genre trouble, I think, was really succinctly summed by Kumeyaay poet Tommy Pico's 2017 book of poetry called Nature Poem, where he writes, "I can't write a nature poem. It's hard for me to imagine curiosity as anything more than a pretext for colonialism. So nah, nature, I don't want to know the colonial legacy of the future." Pico goes on to specify this colonial legacy in California as an environmental idea that drew settlers to the state and then incentivized them by paying $5 for the head of an Indian and 25 cents per scalp. The state, of course, was reimbursed by the feds. And he says, and the water and the blood 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 and the blood. So for Pico, the soil is implied, right, in the blood and soil of the United States and the Settler Project. But he rejects this kind of genocidal environmental tradition, but also reclaims the nature poem of his title, which is the kind of genre work that I'm really interested in. And I think his book, in addition to the many texts that I look at, really testifies to the ways that Indigenous histories and presence provide not just insight into American ecofascism, but model the anti-eco-fascist literary imaginations that prove those fences can be broken, prove that genres like apocalypse, allegory, gothic can be used to commit what I call genrecide, or using literary genre as a tool to destroy the plots of white supremacy. Proving whiteness is not a biological category, but a fiction that changes over time to justify extractive and violent environmental relations. So these genrecidal stories strengthen sovereignties which are at their root unfensible, anti-confinement, anti-colonial, anti-individualist, anti-capitalist, but were enacted by and responsible to Indigenous life, envisioning these futures where we all can breathe. And so to give you a sense of what I mean, I want to briefly discuss just one little portion of my book that focuses on ways that climate change is increasingly imagined as a kind of apocalyptic frontier, where unfortunately these fears of white genocide are kind of lurking under the surface. And it's a fear of white genocide that dates back more than 100 years and was contested before it ever kind of became canonical to our environmental imagination. In 1893, Potawatomi Simon Pokagon wrote a book called The Red Man's Rebuke, where he warned that the incoming tide of the great ocean of civilization rises slowly but surely to overwhelm us. Here he's likening colonial land theft to sea level rise, right? A metaphor that anticipates the now scientifically proven relationship between climate breakdown and colonialism. But he does more than critique. He uses the genre of apocalypse to directly rebuke a proto-fascist fantasy that was at that time consolidating into a form of environmental history with Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. So we know that Turner's thesis is famous for declaring the end of the frontier era, the end of the era of free land. We also know that it was one of the most significant texts of environmental American history for the whole of the 20th century, controlled up to 80% of American history curriculum. But less talked about is the ways that Turner's Frontier influenced Nazi Germany's most recognizable environmental concepts of the Lebensraum, blood and soil, the Herrenvolk ethic, and Herrenvolk democracy. And so here I'm placing, in this chapter of the book, I'm placing Turner's influence and in the context of the kind of apocalyptic visions of race war that many, many American studies scholars are noting in Turner's time. And also reading this kind of apocalyptic end of the white world story that he's telling as a precursor to, the apocalyptic thinking that Chloe mentioned in her introduction, and that scholars like Catherine Bellew and others have traced in the far right today. Specifically, I argue that he is an unacknowledged forerunner to contemporary Great Replacement theories. But we know that he's famous for declaring the end of the frontier, right? The end of free land. But more land was settled after Turner gave his thesis than before. So that fact alone tells us that he's telling a fiction. And we know that some of the ways that he kind of affords this fiction are, to my mind, hallmarks of eco-fascist, American eco-fascist thought. He opens with the census, which is, as we know, the primary tool for the creation and fortification of whiteness. He also then confirms this kind of subtextual fiction of white genocide by turning back to 1817 to quote John C. Calhoun, who says, "We are great and rapidly, I was about to say fearfully, growing." And then, which is of course, demographic anxieties, right, rife through. And then he quotes Andrew Jackson saying that, all land must be gratuitously given away. Not only, directly contradicting his own thesis of the end of the frontier, but I think exemplary of what scholars of fascism tell us, which is that it is not hypocrisy, it is fascism. That, in quoting Jackson, Turner tells us or illuminates what Jack Forbes calls Andrew Jackson's frontier fascism as a form of eco-fascism. Jackson was not only the leading figure of the birth of the White Republic, of course, but he also signed the nation's first conservation legislation at the same time as he was enacting genocidal removal policies. So Turner's using the census to dog whistle white genocide. He confirms it with Calhoun's white fear, reinforces it with Jackson's frontier fascism, and then turns to explicit fiction to kind of fill out his story, where he uses geologic and biological metaphors for colonial violence, and then tells this apocalyptic origin story for settler colonialism, where settlers, nature was at first too strong for the settler, and then by the death of the native, the settler is strengthened. So when the El Paso murderer claims that native genocide merely reinforces his point, this is the frontier ecofascism he's repeating. It reveals, I think, that the Great Replacement conspiracy theory is just a fictionalization of the material structure of settler colonialism. This is, when we recognize this, we can, I think, avert the ways that, that climate fascism collapses our collective climate anxiety into a fear that the tides are threatening to wash away white bodies, collapsing sea level rise into the metaphoric material of the Great Replacement. But these fictions were never inevitable. They were contested before they were ever passed off as history. Months before Turner delivered his eco-fascist screed, Potawatomi Simon Pokagon visited the Chicago World's Fair as one of 200,000 visitors on the opening day. So Turner delivered his thesis, somewhere in the middle of the year of the World's Fair, but Pokagon was there on the first day. And it was a fair that was taking place on his ancestral homeland. And so he shows up, sees this kind of fictional whitewashing of Columbus, of the settler project, and he promptly goes home, pens the Red Man's Rebuke, prints it on birch bark, and then sells it outside the gates. The book is so popular that the mayor of Chicago invites him to be the special guest for Chicago Day, where Pokagon delivers a kind of slightly revised version of the rebuke, and I'd be happy to talk about the differences in Q&A. But they both the speech and the printed version, use this kind of apocalypse genre to expose Turner, Columbus, and more broadly, the kind of white death worlds of settler colonialism. Even the cover claims that it's ongoing. And then the opening lines declare that what was Columbus's discovery was literally merely a conflict between criminals over land. And this is a point that scholars like Gerald Horne make today. So what I think this text is really, it's so exciting and really rich, and in terms of our climate imagination, it really broadens our understandings of the anti-colonial potential lurking in apocalyptic storytelling. That, placed in historical context, we're able to see Pokagon, standing on his ancestral homelands, witnessing this grand kind of amnesia project. Only 3 years after the US Army had slaughtered nearly 300 Lakota followers of the Ghost Dance religion in the Wounded Knee Massacre. And that was and is a form of prophecy that imagines an end to white man's rule. So what we have is a kind of conflicting notion of what the end of the white world looks like here between Pokagon and Turner. But Pokagon does even more than that. He envisions this kind of end of the white world as not just a removal or a disappearance, but a solution for shared survival. And so that's one of the takeaways I'd like us to have is when we think about what we call Landback today, right? That this is not a repetition of the structure of settler colonialism. This is actually a long theorized and imagined storytelling and material tradition that we have to draw on. And so I think throughout, and this is just a picture of the first page, throughout we see Pokagon modeling what it means to use storytelling to destroy the material structures that are causing, threatening the end of the world. A couple of eco-fascist highlights, anti-eco-fascist highlights in Pokagon's writing. He exposes whiteness as not a biological category, but an insatiable relationship of resource extraction. He inverts the colonial trope of disease. He explodes the misreading of Darwin onto social conditions, which we could all use to have in our back pocket, I think. And then he offers a really robust intersectional critique of what we now would recognize as the causes of climate change. He exposes this kind of relation of slavery, mining, hypocritical immigration policies, and the endangerment of the toiling bees as a form or as responsible as, I'm not coming up with my sin structure, but all of these kind of seemingly separate phenomenon as a direct result of what we would call whiteness today. And he likens whiteness to a devastating flood, cyclone, or sea level rise, which, perhaps 20 years ago, a settler scholar like me would read as merely metaphor, but I think Indigenous thinkers have long understood the materiality of that. And then he ends with a kind of prophecy of land rematriation, calling forth these great red men of America and delegating them to cast his audience out of paradise and hurl them headlong through its outer gates into the endless abyss, right? So I'm imagining this text, first handed out at the white gates of the exposition, pronouncing the kind of terminal or eternal damnation of white invaders in this unmistakably apocalyptic language. And what I think that gives us is a way to understand apocalyptic storytelling in a deeply material sense, right? Instead of metaphorizing extinction like Turner's eco-fascist imagination, the El Paso Screed, even my grandmother's Save a Logger t-shirts. I think Pokagon reminds us that Columbus's legacy is also an active work of fiction that gets reinvigorated in climate fascism. And Pokagon reminds us that we are not inevitably damned. In other words, amidst the very material end of the world that Pokagon must have been living through, he was telling a story about the future. And this is an exemplary of what Kutcher-Risling-Baldy and others have noted, that every instance of Landback today began in a story that imagined it. So in this way, I think the rebuke models a really robust environmental history that is rooted in continual lived relationships with place, which teaches us to reject appeals to apocalypse that are divorced from lived experience, to refuse those doom bro stories that court collapse. And it's an example of indigenous texts that I look at, which I find teach me, and I hope teach us, how to think unfensibly, right? How to think about America as a narrative problem and narrative as a site of political struggle. How to see that as the fictions of whiteness spread over landscapes, glaciers retreat. How to see that seeing whiteness is training for seeing climate change. Because nothing about contemporary climate change was or is inevitable. Instead, we can always act. And we can always draw on legacies of people who have understood that agency since before the beginning of what's currently called America. And one of the ways I've tried to do this with others is against the eco-fascist creep, and there's copies here. It's available to download online. There we identify 6 everyday eco-fascist myths, debunk them, and then identify tactics and strategies for combating the circulation of those myths in our everyday. This is especially important in the context of COVID, because we know, and thank you for the shout out earlier, Chloe, that no one is a virus. We know that land use change is the predominant cause of emerging infectious diseases. So even that fact alone tells us that Landback is actually a health mechanism. And so in all, we know that environmental crisis demands we take the racial politics of literary genre seriously, and we learn from literary traditions that have long envisioned the certainty of land return. In short, we know that Landback is the most efficacious and direct form of anti-eco-fascist action. We know indigenous peoples make up 5% of global population, but protect 80% of global biodiversity. On this continent alone, we know indigenous land protectors have blocked or delayed projects equivalent to 1/4 of US and Canada's annual carbon output. And we also know that we have centuries of direct action to draw from. And here's Autumn Black Deer's t-shirt that tells us that direct action resistance has been happening since 1492. Kutcher-Risling-Baldy tells us the Landback movement began in 1493. And they both, and many others, remind us, and I apologize, this is maybe not as clear visually, that Landback just means returning control back to indigenous peoples, not removing all non-indigenous peoples like settler colonialism did and does. And it's already happening. In 2020 and 2021 alone, here's some examples. In California, where I currently live, there's been some really incredible examples. The Undam the Klamath movement started 40 years ago, and those dams are set to the deconstruction of those dams are set for this year. A particularly moving example is the return of Tuluat Island to the Wiyot people. This was a site of horrific massacre in the 19th century, where women, children who were in ceremony were slaughtered in the middle of the night. That land has been returned from the city of Astoria to the Wiyot tribe. And then when we're thinking about ecofascism in particular, I love to cite this example, which is the Save the Redwoods League, which was founded by Madison Grant and Henry Fairfield Osborne, recently bought 523 acres and returned it back to the intertribal Sinkyone Wilderness Group. So all that to say is, even our eco-fascist pasts do not control our futures, right? Even our eco-fascist thoughts do not mean that we have to give them any credence, and we can, kind of take this arc of the Save the Redwoods League as, I think, a great model for non-native folks like me. Because Landback can look any number of ways. On this coast alone, the Lenape-Hoking Landback is restoring place names via these billboards. In New York, land has been returned to the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican people. Two tribes in Delaware are buying back their lands. Churches are returning their lands. And the Nipmuc Nation is in the process of regaining their ancestral land in Belchertown. So these are just a sampling, by no means exhaustive, but when people say that Landback is impossible, that is just inaccurate. It's already happening, and it's been envisioned and talked about since, as we know, 1492, 1493. So non-Native folks like me, I just encourage us to think about, especially whose land we're on, what fights they're in, and join them. And lastly, as I conclude, one of the ways that I really think about it in my own work is welcoming feedback and criticism, which, the Settler Academy just tells us is like the exact wrong relationship to our work. And so I'm just gonna invite any feedback, any criticism that you have of what I've talked about today, as I express my really intense gratitude for your time and for thinking with you together about how to build on these long legacies and presence that promise better worlds. Thank you so much. Oh, and here's the sheriff farm. I meant to say that too. Golly. Yeah, but I'm very excited to hear your thoughts and feedback. Thank you.
All right, so we're gonna have questions coming in from our virtual audience as well as the room. I wanna throw the invitation to the room first, if anyone would like to pose a question to April. And April, do you wanna field them from up there? Sit?
Can I sit? Is that,
Yeah.
okay? Go ahead. Thank you.
I'll start with one from the virtual audience while we warm up in here. Okay, settle.
Yes,
get comfortable. All right, so this one comes from Avi Brisman, who, if I'm remembering correctly, also posed a question to our panel yesterday. First, thank you for such a stimulating talk. I'm wondering to what extent geofencing and kettling, as in the police kettle, feature in your discussion of fencing in the book.
Thank you for that question, Ari. And also thank you for engaging yesterday and today. So in the arc of the book, I spend three chapters in different 19th century moments where, to my mind, I see the United States, the settler state, kind of in a crisis moment of identity and trying to narrate over the crisis of what American identity is. And then the last two chapters of the book go to climate fiction and the ways that some of our most beloved, or at least lauded, narrators of climate fiction are emblematic of this very fenced imagination. And so one example that comes to mind is Ian McEwan's Solar. And that book ends essentially with a so-called climate scientist developing a very fraudulent solar farm on the US-Mexico border, and the landscape is really bounded by the border military. And so it feels to me like quite emblematic of the ways that our imagination of like just climate energy futures are actually, not just like imaginatively bound by those fences, but actually quite literary. Oh my God, you know what? Literally and literarily. There we go. And so I think Ari is totally right. I don't work a lot in security or military studies, so I'm much more comfortable in the like metaphorics that point to those kind of material realities. But I think I would recommend Ari's work, which I had the pleasure of reading last night after emailing with him. So I think the geofencing and kettling is absolutely it. And also Harsha Willia's work is an exhaustive explanation of exactly that. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Questions from our live audience?
It's so warm in here. I know it's so hot to think. In Ithaca, I can't believe it. It's hotter than it is in San Diego.
You planted this a little bit, but I was really curious about the different, the revision to the Red Man's Rebuke that you gestured toward, especially because, you make it so evident that the stories that we tell have a material impact on the worlds that we build.
Yeah.
So the revisions to that story would seem to be material as well. Can you just elaborate?
Yes, thank you for that question. So it's really, I think, a really incredible example of, not just I think, this is, Indigenous scholars reading Pokagan's work have made very clear that he's very strategic in the revisions that he makes for the speech version. And so the Red Man's rebuke is pretty unyielding, as just even the little bit that we saw. It's very direct, it's scathing. And then the version that he delivered for Chicago Day was a much softer version. And he was speaking, some of the estimates say upwards of 70,000 people were in the audience at that day. And there's no projection technology at that time. So almost all of them could not hear him. And they rushed out and bought the rebuke. And so I just think that is like such a smart use of the limitations, right? Where he's leveraging his audience expectations, he's speaking to them in soft terms, and then they're like, well, there's a kind of like an influencer vibe a little bit to Pokagan, right? Where he's like getting all the attention and interest, and then he's leveraging it not only to buy the text, but like to kind of trap settlers in their own capitalist economies, in a way. And I think it's very, very smart. And some of those changes are, I find, much more frequently misread by white scholars as a kind of conciliatory mechanism on Pokagan's part. And I should say that he was also a very complicated figure in his own communities. So not to hold him up as a kind of marker of any, unassailable figure. But those complications, I think, are what teach us how to be better in better community and better allyship. And, they refuse the kind of purity politics that ecofascism is built on. So in many, many ways, that strategy that he uses, even the complications and the disagreement about what the results or effects of those strategies are, I think support a kind of anti-eco-fascist organizing in a way, especially today. Yeah, and there's some really, Blair Tobash Caldwell is a Potawatomi scholar her work on Pokagan is incredible. And I wouldn't dare to, or even have any, I have no authority to weigh in on the like intertribal politics that he's also has a complicated legacy. But I think, in terms of storytelling, he's a incredible example. And I think let's stop teaching Turner and start teaching Pokagan.
For our live audience, Bruno's going to come around with a mic.
I can be loud.
It's for the virtual audience to be able to hear. Yeah.
So the online people can hear.
I'm glad I wandered in. I was sitting in Florida for a while. Nice to
Come
be
sit.
here finally. Yes, I will. Thank you. You're at the Q&A already. I missed it all.
It's okay. It's recorded. You can also
Thank you so much for the very wonderful talk. I'm new to most of the literature that you were talking about, and I'm just wondering if there are some sort of fiction writings that you sort of engage with in terms of, especially indigenous fiction writing, that sort of draws onto contemporary debates, and it may not necessarily be contemporary writing, but in ways that sort of speaks to that kind of settler, white supremacist kind of, especially related to environment and those kind of things, yeah.
Yeah, gosh, yes. I think, a book that comes immediately to mind, which I don't write about in the book, is Silko's Almanac of the Dead. I think does a really fantastic job of that. And so much current, like, indigenous speculative fiction, I think is also a good place to turn. But also, when we think about the lived experience of, I'm a 19th century literature scholar, so I can maybe only speak fairly to that archive. you think about the amount of land use change and like legal maneuvers and all the narrative maneuvers that they're being used to actively erase the violence of those land use changes or land theft. I want to say, without being glib, that like all 19th century native texts and before are doing that. Like I think we could make a case that all of those are climate fiction in one way or another. There's of course a danger of flattening it all into, you know, but it also, I mean, if we acknowledge that colonialism is a primary driver of climate change, that whiteness is the primary fiction that has justified that colonial project, then you know, looking at specific instances of land theft, we get a lot of purchase on the ways that whiteness changes over time, rather than is a kind of flat, unassailable project. And so that to me is like the most exciting intellectual, like the theoretical stuff that comes out of that, right? I don't know if this is kind of a meandering answer, but yes, and I think we see it in speculative fiction. Also, Erdrich's The Future Home of the Living God, when we're thinking about, especially when we're thinking about like reproductive politics today, and the ways that reproductive politics are a kind of aspect of eco-fascist logic, I would also highly recommend that book. Yeah, I mean, I could go on, but you didn't come here for just my mental list.
I have a question from our virtual audience that I think we'll invite you to speak to your archive.
Oh, yeah.
Well, one of your archives. So this is from Moritz Ingersson. This was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. I'm wondering in what ways you would frame Emersonian ideologies of self-reliance, or Thoreau's civil disobedience for that matter, within the legacy of ecofascism, especially also in its echoes in left environmentalism.
Well, thank you for that question. Yes. The framing, I mean, I think, first of all, you know, Emerson and Thoreau are often thought of together, and they're very, very different writers. I admittedly do not like Emerson. I don't like his writing style. And you know, it's something that Nell Irvin Painter spends a lot of, at the History of White People, spends a lot of time on Emerson. I think it's very useful to teach with his work, but she's focused on his English traits, which is like 1856. So less on the early birth of transcendentalism. And the self-reliance piece of that, you know, I mean, maybe it's banal or cliche to note, but like neither one of those men were self-reliant, you know? And so digging into the complexities of both their legacy and their lived experience, I think helps us push back on these very damaging expectations of what constitutes a kind of laudable environmentalism, how we live our daily life. And this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but I in graduate school, I built a tiny house and lived in it as I did my grad studies. And the tiny house movement is obsessed with Thoreau, like just absolutely obsessed. And admittedly, I also love Thoreau. But this self-reliance kind of fetish, right? The realities of living in the tiny house were so different than what I was seeing in these popular media spaces as, you know, Thoreauvian living, going simple. And Thoreau himself was actually very clear about, you know, he wasn't clear that his sister and his mom were doing his laundry, but he was clear that, that the messiness and the muck of living is a much like more vibrant and ecological model, and that everyone deserves, you know, at least a train car to live in. So, you know, I think what all that to say is I think we don't have to throw these men out entirely, but we can read them more carefully in historical context and political context, and then choose, if we want to engage deeply in a close reading, like choose the more efficacious parts of their writing to pull forward, to prevent, you know, the kind of, what we've already seen with the tiny house movement, which is like this complete capitalization of what in many ways was a pretty radical and sometimes anarchist movement space. It's been almost wholly swallowed by a kind of white capitalist, you know, corporate situation, unfortunately. But yeah, I'm not a fan of Emerson. I don't like him. I think Thoreau's a better one if we have to choose between them, though it's not a competition.
I'm happy to bring another question from the virtual audience, unless there's one from the room.
Let's get you the microphone
so that
they can hear you on Cornell.
So once again, apologies for missing your presentation, but I'm very intrigued by the conversation that I'm catching right now. What are the dangers, in your view, April, of a kind of reverse fetishization of, well, those others whose stories we are so hungry for to save us from ourselves, AKA the fetishization of the other, be it the indigenous other or any kind of other, geographical, ethnic, racial, of collectivity, right? So what you just said about Emerson, I mean, obviously there is a lot to critique in that model. How do we go beyond the critical gesture into not, turning just from the individual white savior figure to the collective brown or black or yellow or red savior figure? Because this I often see as coming up as a kind of a zero-sum game in my classrooms, and I was wondering if you had any pedagogical and intellectual way of unpacking it and taking it beyond that binary.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think as much as my work is about centering Indigenous studies and Indigenous scholars and histories in environmental humanities, I think that's one thing that the environmental humanities has done quite well is theorize and critique this ecological Indian trope, right? That I see at least in part maybe reviving. And one thing that I'm really watching right now, and I hesitate to even say it because I feel like it will give ideas, but which is this use, and we saw it a little bit in the El Paso Screed, right? The use of Indigenous history as a form of blood and soil politics, as an argument for like ethno-nationalism, ethno-separate nationalism. So there's a way, and I've seen it in a couple spaces, and I admittedly don't have a nervous system that can do the HN stuff. I rely on other scholars who are reading those deep, dark web spaces. But I've seen it on Twitter and Facebook, a couple instances where Landback is being interpreted as a form of blood and soil politics. And that, of course, is only possible when we think of Indigenous peoples as racial subjects and not distinct political traditions that are vast and varied and change over time. But I do see it as a place that could be capitalized on by far-right rhetoric. The fascist rhetoric and far-right rhetoric is very good at taking something that's popping up in a space and exploiting it. And so I think we have to get really good at explaining the difference between a kind of racial, even if it's a multicultural kind of racial identification with nation and boundary, and a lived set of responsibilities and relationships that are not defined by the nation state, but even earlier, not defined by a kind of hermetically sealed definition of a particular population. But I think you're exactly right. I think it's, I hope to be proven wrong, but I'm very nervous that the visibility of Landback is going to be seized on by these far-right folks and held up as an example of, well, this is the kind of ethno-nationalist project that we're all behind. And so that's why it's very important to remember and to listen to Indigenous folks who remind us that Landback is not about removing all non-Native people, right? It's about returning authority to the original and ongoing stewards of that land. And thinking about, again, the responsibilities and reciprocities to land as a set of social relations rather than a kind of biological or bordered definition of population. Yeah, thank you for that question.
This question comes from Chris L. Is there an anti-colonial way to think about reducing population? I agree with many of your points and that distribution is a problem, but also fear that the industrial agriculture that supports our current population is destructive.
Thank you, Chris, for that. Yeah, I have a couple responses to that. One is to recommend the work of Dr. Jade Sasser, who's incredible on this, and whose work does, and Betsy Hartman, whose work is also really incredible on this question of population. Because we know, so a couple things that we know is even if, even if we didn't care about ethics and the ways that population control rhetoric gets meted out to those most vulnerable, and we thought, okay, well, let's do population control on the highest admitting populations, right? That seems like a math equation that makes a sort of sense, right? Dr. Sasser's work reminds us that even population control focused on the most consumptive or the highest carbon footprint populations doesn't work. And the United States is a very good example of this, right? The last 40 years, we've been in a steady population decline. At the same time, our carbon emissions have grown exponentially. So the math of population control doesn't work, and it is always directed on vulnerable populations. And so this is something, as somebody who grew up in a very kind of lefty environment, this is the myth that keeps getting repeated. And we know that Malthus was proved wrong. We know that Garrett Hardin was proved wrong before he published his stuff by Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for her work. And then we know that population control doesn't work. We know the way it gets meted out. And then even if we were going to do some sort of targeted population control, Dr. Jade Sasser and Betsy Hartman's work also proves that doesn't work. So, and I think that Chris was exactly right. It's like it's not population, it's industrial agriculture is the problem. So directing our efforts to those systems, I think, is a really, really, really vital intervention that we all can participate in some way. Yeah. Again, a little preachy.
Other questions from the room? The mic to Erin, please.
Thank you. Hey, great to see you, April. Thank you
you
for the talk. It was great. I have a pretty straightforward question. I mean, the background to it is more that I'm really interested in sort of intellectual traditions and genealogies, and I'm wondering what you might say about sort of where you come from intellectually, what traditions you are building on, where you think the scholarly community has been going over the last couple of decades that you're a part of. But my more sort of simple and straightforward question is just, I'm just wondering, you didn't really use the phrase environmental justice in this talk, and I'm just wondering what your relationship is to that as an idea and a field.
Yes, thank you for that. And thank you for that, yes, I love, I've learned, from I lament how late I learned how important actually where I come from is to my work. I kind of, late in my PhD, started thinking, oh, right, the spotted owl, right? Like, oh, earth fur, oh, okay, this is all, like, all these pieces were making sense. And that was, I think, very clearly a form of, like, a move to innocence on my own part, trying to separate myself from things that I was analyzing. So, it's first and foremost, in a very kind of basic way, an interrogation of my own thought patterns and the ways that, so much of what I have come to understand through years and years of graduate school, that what I thought was common sense has been long disproven environmental attitudes or dispositions. And so yeah, it feels like my work feels very, very intimate in that way, but admittedly, it was late for me to realize. I felt like that ultimately I was just kind of studying my own upbringing in some way. But in terms of, more intellectual or academic communities, the environmental humanities has been the primary home for my work for a long, long time. And it has those fields have absolutely transformed in the last 10 years. When I first started working on this, half to 3/4 of my conference time or whatever speech time I was allotted was about laying out the math equation about why we have to think about whiteness when we have to think about climate change. And now in my classrooms or in work like this, you can just say it. I mean, the IPCC report just printed it last year. So I think that the field is it's just like at a really exciting growth moment, both in terms of the diversity of thought that is coming in, the diversity of representation of scholars that hopefully feel more included and welcome. And it does present, I think, some challenges in terms of that genealogical work that I think most of us are pretty invested in because, it's a problem set, especially for scholars like me, is I really hear white folks, you need to get your people, right? Like that's my job. Those are my communities. I'm responsible for speaking in and through those communities, including those intellectual traditions, but how much is too much time to spend with them? And so I think it's a space that scholars like me are really wrestling with is, not wanting to appropriate intellectual traditions that we don't necessarily belong to, but also feeling a deep conviction to listen and learn from, environmental justice communities, environmental justice scholars, and also indigenous traditions that have, not typically fallen under our definition of environmental justice. And I think people are finding different ways to solve that problem. I don't think there's a certain singular way to go about it. For me, it's about, I really wrestle with as deeply intimate as I feel like my work is. I also don't want to center myself in that work. But I also feel responsibility to model learning, active learning and learning in public, and which is easier to intellectualize than it actually is to do. To feel like, oh right, I really messed up on that one, right? So I think all that to say is that we're, I think, in a moment where we're figuring out how to expand those intellectual traditions, but also read some of these people closely, right? And that feels like my job for my positionality, and it may not be other folks in the field's job. But I continually learn how to do that job better by being in better and more accountable relationships to communities of color, indigenous communities, and and I wish I would get to the point where I wouldn't think that I make mistakes, but I definitely do. I definitely make mistakes. Even calling the El Paso shooters' text a manifesto is something that I've learned in the last 2 years to not do, because manifestos are supposedly, intellectually coherent, and these things are not that. So yes, the words matter. The words matter, and I'm learning more and more about how they do. And in terms of environmental justice, I think we're just so lucky for the fights that what we consider traditional environmental justice movements have made, and the models. And we have a real opportunity to expand our ideas of environmental justice to recognize fights, against colonialism everywhere as belonging to those traditions. Without flattening them all into the same fight. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
I have 2 of my own, so maybe we can take turns.
No, I wanted to. Sorry.
Can we
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to piggyback.
Thank you.
Make sure the
mic is turned back on also.
Yep. So I wanted to piggyback on Aaron's question by mostly because manifesto was my idea in our co-authored paper. And I'm wondering exactly, I want to use that manifesto as kind of a springboard, what counts as a legitimate taxonomy of what constitutes public speech acts, right? So but I don't want to debate manifesto. That's, I think, like a fairly trivial point. What are your thoughts? Because I know that you are happy always to be uncomfortable, at least in my limited experience of your generous company, of the universalization and this whole conversation of some sort of Anglophonia that is also global. In the sense of, sure, again, in my previous question, I was actually referring to the fetishization of collectivity by the left, not the dangers of its appropriation, although I think the two go together, right? So those people who are doing all the great work, they also speak not English. Like, what are the plans of the environmental humanities, mostly Anglocentric, and most visibly just assuming that the world is Anglophone, right? So where do you see us breaching those walls? Right? Where Anglophonia is not a global condition. It really is not, both in terms of intellectual work and actual movement activism.
Yeah, I feel like I should just pass the mic to you. I mean, like, not as a bunting on the question, but actually, like, literally what that is. And I think I feel totally not unqualified to answer. I certainly have an answer to that, but an unqualified.
No, it's not a fair question to you.
No, it is a fair question. Yeah. It is, because I do think that you know, there's a and let me see how I want to answer this. This universalization of Anglophone in a kind of global sense is, in some ways, the very root of the beginning of eco-criticism and environmental humanities as a field, right? It has so long been a kind of the story that the field tells about itself, about first and second wave, is very Anglophilic. And my sense is, folks like me who are not, I'm not qualified to read or speak in any other language at the level that I am English. I think we're at a point where there's a real tension between this recognition of needing and actively, like you were saying, legitimately not even needing to decenter Anglophone literature and Anglophone thought, but that actually the robust traditions that we have at our disposal in terms of like global traditions are not Anglophone, and the undeniable kind of whiteness of the field is so deeply entrenched, both in terms of like who has the jobs and who's going to conferences, and the kind of texts. So, I mean, I'm basically just repeating what your question says.
No, but
yes.
I want to think beyond the
Yeah.
What do we do about it?
What do we do about it? Well, okay, so some things I can think about, that I think about are, in very practical terms, like lending or funneling resources towards scholars of color. That's why I feel like one thing I can do both in the classroom and as a colleague. I know in terms of the Association for Literature of the Environment, which I've been on the executive council, this has long been a discussion, sometimes heated, about affiliations of the organization across the globe and how to handle that. And there's been some nerves or anxiety about lending the organization's authority to like non-verified groups. Yes, this is, so all that to say is it's a pretty robust discussion inside that organization, which is, one of the only ones that I have that kind of intimate knowledge of. In terms of like, I think maybe more or less academic organizing, I feel like it's not my place to talk about social movement organizing, but to learn from, from that. But so I feel like there's two questions. Is like, what is environmental humanities plan, right? Which is about broadening and broadening the fields, broadening the representation, broadening the text and the type of text that we consider environmental humanities. But in terms of, maybe more broad coalition building without fetishizing the collectivity, I feel like we have to be grounded in very specific material politics, and really avoid these general statements about, what is appropriate organizing and who deserves to be an authority in a particular social movement space. Yeah, I feel like I'm like dancing around your question, but it's good. That's good. This is you successfully made me uncomfortable, but I wish I could answer it in a more satisfying way. But I will say for me, the most exciting learning that I'm doing is in the conversations that Black Studies is having with Indigenous Studies. Like I just feel like there's a lot of really exciting theorizations that are coming out of that, and also some really kind of places where, they're not, those fields are not going to agree, and people internal to those fields are not going to agree. And that's, for like a white environmentalist like myself who has grown up on like the harmony myth, right? That's a very challenging like growth space for me to sit in, to like listen to these groups talk, and as if that's one thing. But those fields, I think, are really producing some very, very exciting guidelines or metrics by which we can judge our own actions, Thank you, Anandita.
We'll keep talking at the dinner about this. I have two questions. They are very loosely linked. One is about your contention here and in other writing that ecofascism is first and foremost a literary tradition. I wanted to invite you to like speak a little bit more to the stakes of that, and maybe do that comparatively. Like, what would it mean to call ecofascism a literary tradition instead of a legal political tradition, instead of a, I don't know, like some other category. Just like I want to hear more, because I'm sure that the stories exceed the fact that your training is in literature, right? And then kind of related to that, so I understood the case for ecofascism being a literary tradition to have at least three parts, right? Because stories have material force, because it's self-referential, and because eco-fascist fantasy rests on a set of fictions. And then you were speaking about like why you choose Screed over Manifesto, to name the incoherence, the intellectual incoherence of these documents. And I happened to be reading Umberto Eco's Fascism earlier this week, and one of the core arguments of that piece is that fascism is by definition intellectually incoherent.
Yes.
I just pulled it up. He writes, the contradictory picture I described was not the result of tolerance, but of political and ideological discombobulation, but it was a rigid discombobulation, a structured confusion. So I'm just like, I don't know exactly what the question is there, but like maybe it's, let me see if I can spin one out. So one of the things that you're doing by naming the fictions here is undermining the narratives. But if incoherence was always part of the project, what does that do? So those are some questions. You could take up whatever you want.
Yeah, that's good. I think I may, if I have written that it's first and foremost literary tradition, I may want to retract that. But I think we can't talk about it without talking about it as a literary tradition, I guess. And that, I think we gain a couple of things. One is seeing texts that we have typically thought of as nonfiction as really trucking in some serious fantasy and fiction. And then I also think that the reading through the lens of genre helps actually illuminate those inconsistencies that Eco and others have noted. Because genre comes with a set of expectations, right? When things are incoherent to those sets of expectations, they become really, really visible. So to my mind, genre is a very useful lens to read through because it illuminates like all those moves that get, passed over because the kind of tone is incoherent. So we just forgive a lot of those moves. So that I think I think that's maybe what we gained, but I don't think it's instead of a legal or political tradition. It's in some ways I think it's how the legal and political traditions continue, like is the literary tradition. It greases that kind of pipeline a bit. And in terms of this like Screed manifesto, it's a very active debate in scholars on ecofascism is, should we even call it ecofascism because do they even really actually care about the environment, right? And I have, people whose work I really respect think we shouldn't call it ecofascism because they actually are just using environment as a way to like, one, recruit more people who may be experiencing climate anxiety, but also just to like slide their ideologies into maybe previously unfriendly spaces. And I hear and I understand their points, and I also think the risk of not taking them seriously is too high. And we don't hold anyone else to that sort of standard. It's like, well, are you really serious? This doesn't, like, prove to me you're serious first before I take you seriously, and we just do not hold any other intellectual tradition to that standard. So this has been a pretty robust, we've had some robust or intense conference dinners over this discussion. But I think, so while I take the point to call it a screed, not a manifesto, I also don't think that just because it's a screed means that, it should be written off, which many, especially with the Buffalo shooters text, right, is overwhelming in its like pastiche. It's just copied and pasted memes and shit posts and citations that look legitimate, but actually almost none of them are. There's a couple that are legitimate, meaning peer reviewed, which of course is not always legitimate. But so I think the words matter. And I think the literary lens helps us kind of suss how these ideas continue to go under the radar. When we think of it, I feel like if we think about it as solely a legal and political tradition, then its incoherence kind of negates our attention, right? But as a literary tradition, we're, literary scholars are used to reading for like how metaphors work throughout a text. And so taking that lens, I think, trains us all, and we all imbibe so much media. I would argue that we're all kind of primed to be literary and media critics in a way that that I want to activate for us to read these folks a little more closely, and that's why the El Paso text to me, is the most interesting because it's the first time that indigenous genocide has been cited as rationale. And so why is that story popping up now? Right? Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. I think we probably have time for one more, if there's one more from the room. Yeah. Sorry, Mike.
Thank you for the talk and the rich Q&A as well. Kind of building on these last couple of questions, I wonder, as I'm wrapping my head around the term and the idea of environmental humanities, just kind of digging into that, I'm also thinking, what is as intersectional or inherently intersectional as that, and also could provide ways to bring people together under
common circumstances, not essentially common beliefs, because that would be a tough, tough presupposition to try that out. So I guess what I'm saying is, have you seen, that leans towards spirituality to me, whether that has to be coupled with environmental spirituality or just spirituality as a baseline. Have you seen any or have witnessed yourself or participated in any of those intersectional conversations or ceremonies or dinners or whatever that may speak to the ability of these different sides of the equation that are both feeling loss, you know, the fear of loss, left, the right, indigenous, white settler, colonialism. Have you seen any threads come from that? Are you diving into the spirituality conversations at all? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you. I've never had that question, and I love it so much. First of all, this is one of, I think, the aspects that first drew me to Indigenous studies. Is because, you know, I was partially raised in the evangelical church, and found myself very frustrated, and I felt like in my scholarship there was it still felt like a lack, right? Like the evangelical church didn't feel right to me, but I also felt like there was I couldn't talk about spiritual needs because it felt like somehow anathema to academic pursuits. And when it felt like, you know, when I first kind of started reading and learning from Indigenous studies scholars, spirituality was always there. It's just front and center. And not in a dogmatic way, but in a way that was like recognizing our needs as spiritual people, you know, as spiritual beings. And that felt really right to me. And so in that way, you know, that has been a kind of sustenance, I think, that I've gotten that I don't necessarily talk too much about in my work, but also it remains very obviously true that like many 19th century, almost all 19th century, what we think of as like American environmental writers, you know, Emerson was a Unitarian minister, right? Like you can't really read, especially early 19th century American environmental thought without encountering religious questions, and that's sort of been kind of forgotten out, I think, of a lot of environmental humanities work. But I do feel like there's a lot of turn back towards spiritual questions happening in some spaces. You know, obviously Indigenous studies, but also in Black studies spaces, in some like religious organization spaces. I know there's some I don't follow it as closely, but like green Christian movements and maybe less Christian religious traditions that are also taking that up. And so I think there's a lot of exciting possibilities. And one very, I think, emblematic example of this is I'm teaching a class right now on ecofascism, and I opened up the final project for like kind of whatever they wanted to do, and the students decided they wanted to hold an exhibition of all their projects. And one student said, Ken wants their final project to be a vigil at the end for grief and for like hope. And when that student mentioned it in the classroom, all the students were like, yes. And you know, I have a little bit of shivers talking about, because I wouldn't have thought that would feel like such an uncomplicated offering because of my own history of that. So, or my own complicated relationship with evangelical Christianity. And they're so excited. And so that's in 2 weeks. I can report back how that goes. But, you know, in terms of the classroom, I think what I hear from students is they really recognize that desire to connect in that way and to like mourn and also to believe in something, whether it's a shared future or just the shared experience of grief and fear, that you know, questions of spirit really, I think, are the best way to answer that in some ways. So I think you are absolutely right. Yes. Thank you for that.
I think we'll leave it there. Join me in thanking April.
Thank you all.
And please have snacks.
Vegan sushi.